Welcome to our first Equality Talks event for Human Rights Week 2020, presented by the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission and RMIT's Social Innovation Hub. I'm so pleased that so many people across Victoria and some from interstate are able to join us today. My name's Howie. I'm the Head of Legal and Dispute Resolution at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. To begin with today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you. That's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and also pay my respect to any elders who might be joining us today from Aboriginal land around Australia. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today marks the beginning of Human Rights Week for 2020, a week-long celebration of the role that human rights play in our everyday lives. And on the agenda today, we have 5 very talented people reflecting on the year that was in terms of democracy and accountability, policing and justice, and community-led activism. We'll reflect on what we've learned in the last 9 months about how you protect rights whilst also imposing restrictions that protect public health. It's been a year like no other, and these have all been critical issues as Victoria's weathered the COVID-19 storm. If human rights are about the relationship between government and the people it serves, then the pandemic has highlighted just how critical that relationship is in our day-to-day lives. Human rights have been at the heart of many of Victoria's public conversations in the last 9 months or so. There were weeks where you couldn't open a newspaper or listen to the radio without hearing wide-ranging analysis and opinions on masks and curfews and restrictions on social gatherings and other limits on our freedom of movement. This heightened interest and awareness of Victorians' human rights was evident also in the work of the Commission, where we saw it reflected in a 6-fold increase in inquiries about the Charter's operation. We also received 30% more complaints under the Equal Opportunity Act in this financial year, much of the increase attributable to COVID response measures. The heightened interest and awareness of Victorians' human rights was in part because the COVID restrictions applied so broadly, but also because some of them were so severe. Given the restrictions that we saw on rights, it's extremely positive that the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities has continued to operate throughout the pandemic. It sets a welcome precedent for the continued protection of human rights, even during crises. The Charter has continued to guide lawmaking in this state and ensures that Parliament considers whether impacts on human rights are necessary and justified when it's making laws. It's also continued to apply to the actions and decisions of public authorities, and we'll hear more about this impact today on the Victoria Police. Another theme to emerge strongly in the last 9 months was the essential role of democratic accountability in maintaining public trust. The declaration of the state of emergency in March and later a state of disaster gave the government extraordinary powers not just to implement public safety measures, but to redirect government resources and override typical parliamentary processes. Our speaker, Tom Daly, will explore some of these ideas. Early on in the pandemic, the Commission identified 6 principles that we thought should guide Parliament and public authorities' response to the pandemic to ensure that they fulfilled their Charter obligations. In short, those principles are that restrictions on human rights must be necessary and proportionate, they must be time-bound, they must be lawful, and that means consistent with Charter rights. Government should be as transparent as possible, including providing information to people in an accessible form, and that's accessible for people with disabilities and for people who speak languages other than English. There should be appropriate oversight of the restrictions, and finally, that safeguards and support should be provided to people where their rights are limited. The Commission has returned to these 6 principles throughout the pandemic, and they've provided for us a really valuable framework for assessing the human rights implications of government action. We applied these principles, for example, when we looked at the enforcement of public health measures by Victoria Police, the issuing of infringements and the review processes for those infringements, and also the policing of protest. But this period has also seen extraordinary moments of community organising and solidarity. One very clear example is the full lockdown of the 9 public housing towers in July, where some 3,000 people experienced significant restrictions on their rights. We heard that many people struggled to access information about the lockdown, to access food that was sufficient and culturally appropriate, and to access medical care and other support. There's no doubt that this was an extraordinarily difficult period for many people, but the examples of community collaboration and unity that emerge from this chapter put into really stark relief just the value and enormous potential of community-led responses. Reflecting on these experiences, we can see just how fundamental it is that people are able to participate in decisions that affect their human rights. And this has to be a critical part of Victoria's recovery from the pandemic. Looking back, the pandemic's effects were in some respects depressingly predictable. It's magnified and exacerbated existing inequalities for women, for people with disabilities, for people in casualised work, or for people from multicultural communities. Yet the lockdown restrictions also highlighted the centrality of human rights in all of our lives. It may have also assisted those who experience a degree of privilege in their day-to-day life to imagine that protection of human rights is now something that's also relevant to them. What lies before us is a period of change and of opportunity. The opportunity not just to rebuild what we had, but to reimagine something better, something more inclusive, something that prizes participation in government decision-making and that protects and upholds the rights that we're all entitled to. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be hearing from 5 experts, and each speaker will deliver a short keynote address in the style of a TED Talk before we move into Q&A session for the final portion of today's event. I encourage you to join the conversation online. If you'd like to share your reactions and reflections on Twitter or Facebook, you can use the hashtag Equality Talks 2020 and Rights in Recovery. On the screen now, you can see the handles for our panelists in case you want to tag them in your post. And if you have questions for our panelists, we'd love to hear them. You can submit your question using the Zoom Q&A function. So to do that, you need to use the button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll work through as many questions as we can when we get to the Q&A at the end. So for now, let's get started. Our first speaker today is Associate Professor Tom Daly. Tom is the Deputy Director of the University of Melbourne School of Government, Director of the Global Research Platform Democratic Decay and Renewal, and a member of the International Coalition for Democratic Renewal. Along with extensive experience in the university sector, Tom has worked across government and international organisations, including running the Office of the Chief Justice of Ireland for 6 years, managing a $4.7 million Council of Europe judicial reform project in Turkey, and designing a pan-continental African judicial network for the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Tom's current research project, COVID-Dem, charts how the pandemic is affecting democracy in Australia and worldwide. So please welcome Tom Daly.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction, and sincere thanks to the Commission for the invitation to kick off this really great series of events for Human Rights Week. I'm going to speak about the role of democratic accountability during the COVID-19 crisis and how we can learn lessons from the crisis to maintain and strengthen accountability as we move, hopefully, into the recovery phase. And in doing this, I should say that since the crisis hit here at the Melbourne School of Government, we've been examining these issues, especially through our Governing During Crises project, especially a series of policy briefs produced since June, as well as my own COVID Dem project, which Emily just mentioned. So I just want to start with 3 quick points. So first is that Australia has been among world leaders when it comes to its COVID-19 response. The number of cases and the death rate is extremely low compared to many other countries. Not only the extreme cases of the US, the UK, Brazil, and so on, but also comparator countries like Canada and Ireland. Second is that Victoria obviously stands out internationally for having one of the longest and strictest lockdowns related to COVID. And there's nothing inherently undemocratic about a lockdown or other emergency measures as long as they're taken within the clear constraints of the law, as long as they're necessary and proportionate, they're based on evidence, and they're subject to regular review, which has largely been the case here. But these measures do have a major impact on rights, of course, including rights to freedom of assembly, association, protest, religion, and so on. And that means that accountability issues are acutely important in ensuring the legitimacy of the measures taken, that the different situations of diverse communities are taken into account, and that the public can have confidence in the measures taken. And it's on this dimension that when judged against a lot of comparator countries, there's been a bit of a hole in Australia's pandemic response. And that's the sidelining of parliaments across the country at all levels. And that's the main thing I want to quickly address before I talk about other accountability mechanisms. So you get this rather stark difference in that by April, the UK Parliament had already put measures in place to have a hybrid parliament mixing remote and in-person attendance. The Canadian Parliament did that by the end of May, but similar measures were not put in place for the federal parliament here until August. So we did have the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19, for example, the use of informal pairing systems to allow short sittings, but Parliament was effectively functioning quite minimally for months on end. And although that has left fourth branch institutions like the Commission here, as well as media, human rights, and other civil society organizations trying to fill the scrutiny gap, but facing major challenges in doing so. Now, at least going through the COVID process, we have a process and model in place now for keeping Parliament functioning during times of crisis. And we actually organized a discussion with the President of the Senate recently, where he was of the view that this will be mainly a crisis model, the hybrid model. But others say that we need to use this as an opportunity to make better use of technology more widely, to change how we run Parliament, to achieve better access for those in regional and remote areas, to make it easier for witnesses to appear before Parliament and so on. And interestingly, research from the UK shows that during hybrid sittings, MPs spent more time debating the substance of issues, that there was less heckling, that female MPs contributed more frequently. And that all speaks to important issues like, how does Parliament act as a mechanism of accountability when the power of governments, of executives, is growing? How representative is Parliament? How representative should it be? Who speaks for the marginalised and the disempowered in Parliament? How might an Indigenous voice to Parliament enhance how Parliament works? And that's all to say, who's in the room when the balance between rights and responsibilities is being struck? Who gets to be heard? Who gets to be part of that conversation? And these questions have been thrown into very sharp relief by the pandemic, due to its disparate impact, with women being hit even harder than men in many ways, or the impact on Indigenous communities, on immigrant communities like international students, for example. And I think in the recovery, we need to look more fully, more closely at these bigger questions, not just in future-proofing parliaments for possible future crisis scenarios. Now, my final point in the 2 minutes I think I have is about other mechanisms of accountability. So I'd start by saying it's important to highlight that courts have a very clear role here as well. But as an accountability mechanism, they clearly can't substitute for the parliamentary process. They act solely as a backstop, a highly important and necessary one, but still a backstop. And the judicial process is a very different process to Parliament in the way that it frames issues, in the time frame for decisions, and who the decision makers are. Second is that one of my biggest concerns regarding the impact of COVID is how it's accelerated the hollowing out of the media landscape, especially at the local level. So by June, 200 media outlets had been merged or closed down. And although we're seeing some green shoots and expansions now, the overall picture remains very troubling regarding the information ecosystem we need for debate and discussion essential to a healthy democracy and accountable government. And that all makes the work of organisations like the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission even more important. But I just want to finish on a note of hope, and that's that one of the developments during COVID that has given me real hope is the push for greater participation in the political process and decision making. So we see citizens' assemblies established in the UK, for example, to provide a voice for a citizen-led economic recovery, rather than simply leaving it to committees of politicians and business leaders. We see local communities coming together to push forward media initiatives to plug the gap in the decimation of local media. And that all tells us that democracy contains the seeds of its own recovery. And if we can learn essential lessons from the crisis and achieve a mix of top-down and bottom-up action to ensure that we have the accountability that we need, we can ultimately have a democratic system that's healthier post-crisis than it was before even the pandemic hit, to reimagine something better, as Emily said in her introduction. So really looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for the invitation again.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I think that's a really wonderful way to shape the democratic accountability subject by really thinking of democracy as something beyond the institutions and something that we all participate in, and that many different institutions participate in. Next to the stage, to the virtual stage, please welcome Roj Amedi, a community organiser, strategist and writer. Roj's life's work focuses on LGBTI+ issues, refugees and racial justice, with an interdisciplinary background in public policy, media and strategy. This expertise and perspective is underpinned by her intersecting lived experiences as a queer person and a former refugee from Iraqi Kurdistan. Roj's advocacy work has helped communities across the country to pursue economic justice and a non-discriminatory migration system, improve representation across public institutions, combat the rise of white supremacist groups, and stamp out structural racism and discrimination. Roj is currently the Manager of Engagement and Communications at Justice Connect. She also sits on the board of the Human Rights Arts and Film Festival and Overland Literary Journal. Please welcome Roj Amedi.
Thanks so much, Emily. I want to acknowledge the peoples of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of the land in which I am calling from. I've been very lucky to be here for most of the year, enjoying and appreciating these sovereign lands. I want to acknowledge their elders past and present, and also acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. And so, as Emily has explained, my life's work is economic and racial justice. And so I've done this through many, many capacities, whether formal or informal. And I consider this as like part of me existing and connecting and investing in the communities around me. And what I want is a purpose, a life's purpose of lifting everyone out of the kind of material inequities that we see across the board. What I want to ask today is, what does human rights look like when people have the resources to engage with one another and the capacity to determine and define their lives? COVID-19 has completely exposed the inequities and the gaps that we've seen across the board. Whether you're a disabled person, a person of color, a First Nations person, a migrant, or a undocumented worker in this country, you essentially could be denied access to our democratic processes and also denied the material capacity to be able to engage with and comply with the ways that we've restricted human rights. The way I will explain this is by telling you a tale of two COVID-19 responses that are community-led. On one hand, I supported a large community, thousands of people on an online Facebook closed community of Northside-based, mostly white, affluent people. Throughout the pandemic, we supported people to reach out to their neighbors, to check on the people who may be sleeping rough in their neighborhood, to reach out to their neighborhood houses and other small community organizations, and even fundraise for a range of initiatives to support people who may not have access to resources. Within a couple of months, people were taking each other's dog for a walk, figuring out how to keep their kids occupied, dropping off recipes to each other's houses. It was a great experience of social cohesion. I heard from various members of the groups that they had multiple letters from their neighbors. They finally met people over the fence. They found out who had the delicious lemons that they could swap with their spanakopita. It was a really great and fortuitous experience. In contrast, I also supported, as a person who grew up in public housing and also was a refugee, and was supported by a strong social safety net, I also work in solidarity with First Nations and communities of color that often live in public housing. And so a lot of my friends and comrades lived in the public housing estates or had family or were very, very deeply involved in the communities across the public housing estates. And so this was a community that had rung the alarm on the inadequacies of the infrastructure in those housing, the lack of air ventilation, the lack of support in terms of, basic needs such as hand sanitizer, etc. And also no kind of understanding that their landlord, the Victorian government, was going to provide the kind of infrastructure and structural supports to support the community to withstand this pandemic. And so a lot of people were raising the alarm only to be fallen on complete silence and no response. And so a lot of people were feeling very, very uncomfortable, and knowing that a lot of the people who were living in public housing were already facing a lot of inequities based on the fact that most were working in casualized workforces. They were dealing with bosses who were bullying them about turning up to work, and they had no leave provisions. And so when the public housing detention orders were introduced, you saw an immediate response of a 500 plus police descend onto people's doorways without any clear command and direction, and then no kind of communication to the people who were residing in these houses. This is an amazing and incredible story because not only were people facing very clear denial of their human rights, they were also able to enact a whole community and take action as a whole community based on years and years of work. And so I supported a range of young people and small community organizations that are not necessarily institutionalized. And we started to enact all the relationships, all the depth, all the solidarity that we had built over the years in supporting our various communities, in building these relationships, and able to enact those things into such an incredible response to support the community, getting medication in, translating resources, making sure that people were okay. They were doing mental health and well-being checks. This was in contrast to about a week and a half of disarray from institutions and government forces that were completely disengaged and not connected to these communities. One of the biggest lessons of COVID-19 is that if you haven't built these relationships with communities, if you haven't centered the people who would be the biggest beneficiaries of any program or project, these times of crises will either encompass and really represent all that hard work and investment in these relationships, or it will show that you have complete disconnection from these communities and that you haven't empowered them, but also you haven't acknowledged their methods of working and their methods of self-determination. I always talk about the incredible work of First Nations community-led health responses to COVID-19 and how incredible these community-led and owned First Nations health organizations were able to respond to the needs of their community on like very little resources and somehow be able to be, you know, at the forefront of public health orders and recommendations. You saw that in the Black Lives Matter protest earlier in the year, where people were wearing masks, supporting each other with hand sanitizer, really applying a public health order that was way more advanced than what was being expressed. And so I guess what I'm saying is that in order for us to really be able to allow people to live and to enact human rights and to actually be beneficiaries of human rights, they need to have the material tools and resources to be able to do so. Otherwise, they become intangible policies, something for paper shuffling. We need to think about people's housing, ventilation, accessibility, education, ability to read and speak and translate and interpreted languages, and also an connection and affirmation of a multitude of ways of working. Because in order for us to be a truly multicultural community and also a community that affirms human rights, we need to understand how those human rights are enacted by different cultures and identities of people. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roj. It's so great to have this perspective from the community action that you've been doing over the last 9 months, and to really see such great examples of how communities come together. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions about those at Q&A. So our next speaker will be familiar to many of you. Assistant Commissioner Luke Cornelius is Victoria's longest serving Assistant Commissioner. He joined Victoria Police in 2003 following 14 years service as a federal agent with the Australian Federal Police. He currently leads the Northwest Metro region. A qualified barrister and solicitor, Luke has worked in legal services and ethical standards roles for Victoria Police. He also headed up the Victoria Police engagement with the Commission's 5-year review into sex discrimination and sexual harassment in Victoria Police. In 2010, he was awarded the Australian Police Medal for contribution to police reform, the promotion of ethics and integrity in policing. A member of Victoria Police Command, Assistant Commissioner Cornelius also sits on the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine Council, the Victorian Donor Tissue Bank Management Committee, and he is the Chief Commissioner's representative on the Blue Ribbon Foundation Board. Please welcome Luke Cornelius.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many people participating in this forum. Can I too acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we meet, and from where I sit, that is land which has been in the custodianship of the peoples of the Kulin Nations, and in particular the Wurundjeri for many generations, and I acknowledge their custodianship and care of the land and waters, and also acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And also as someone who's had the privilege of Welcome to Country, I call to mind our promise in being Welcome to Country that we will care for the land, waters and people that we find here. So there's much to cover in 7 minutes, and I'm sure that many of you would be keen to understand what does it look like from a policing perspective within the context of policing and supporting a community within the context of a global pandemic, the likes of which we've not seen for nigh on 100 years. So I might begin with a human rights perspective, of course, on this. Many of you who may have heard police speak about their role in community will hear us refer back to Sir Robert Peel, a male white colonialist from 200 years ago. I would probably refer to a more contemporary white male colonialist, Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong. After he quit Hong Kong, he was given the role of conducting a review into policing in Northern Ireland. And that was a key part of the Northern Ireland police deal. That was the abolition of the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the creation and establishment of a policing service that was owned by the community. And he summed up his work with these words: policing means protecting human rights. That piece of thinking is also reflected in the objects and role of Victoria Police in the Victoria Police Act. That is, our role is to serve the Victorian community and uphold the law so as to promote a safe, secure and orderly society. And our functions are very reflective of long-standing human rights, preserving the peace, protecting life and property, preventing crime, detecting and apprehending offenders and helping those in need of assistance. So acknowledging all of that, I'd have to say to you, if someone had said to me 6 months ago, Luke, you're going to find yourself in charge of and directing operations within the context of a legal framework that prohibits people from leaving home to protest, that will require you to deploy large numbers of police to lock down communities, I would have looked at you aghast. I could not have contemplated those sorts of actions as being any further removed from what people have long accepted to be the role of police and the nature of our relationship with community. And I can say to you, as I have worked through how this has evolved, and let's remember that our role, Victoria Police's role in this context, is as a support agency, not as the control agency. So this is a crisis which is under the control ultimately of DHHS as the control agency. And within that context, the Chief Health Officer directions have very much shaped what the rules are that apply to a community and the rules which Victoria Police have been required by the Chief Health Officer to enforce. Now, the only way that we've been able to get through this to this point has been by continuing to have a regard for and a focus on the Human Rights Charter. And it's very important to recognise and acknowledge that the Human Rights Charter has not been put to one side. It was not overridden. It's absolutely continued to operate. And it certainly assisted us from a policing perspective to strike or find the right balance. Now, some of you might find that to be a surprising or hard thing to believe. But I might just explain to you a little bit, if I can focus on protest, explain to you a little bit what that has looked like. Our approach to policing protest has shifted as the Chief Health Officer directions have shifted. So for a time, and this was the case during the Black Lives Matter protest, it was not unlawful to leave home to protest. although there were restrictions on the size of outdoor public gatherings and other requirements. And so our policing approach to the Black Lives Matter protest was very much tailored in response to the rule system that applied at that time. That, of course, again shifted when we moved into the full-on stage 4 lockdowns, where in actual fact, there were only 4 reasons you could leave home. And it was made very clear to us by the Chief Health Officer that leaving home to protest wasn't included in those 4 reasons. And so bizarrely, we found ourselves in the situation of policing in a context where public protest, that is leaving home to protest, was in fact unlawful. And then, of course, thankfully, more recently, with the easing of those restrictions post stage 4, we're back into, if you like, a much more normal situation. And that is when the social interaction reason was introduced, leaving home to protest was again permissible. So the key point that I'd make is that we've been careful to try and adapt our policing response in support of the public health imperatives that are reflected in the Chief Health Officer directions every step of the way. And this is a key point that I'd make. One of the challenges in policing, of course, is that often we find ourselves in situations where we need to weigh up, if you like, competing rights. Some people obviously seek to exercise their right to protest, while others have very particular rights around protection of property, freedom of movement and the like. And when those rights exercised by individuals come into conflict, oftentimes it's down to the police to work out how to mediate those potential conflicts. Now, in a normal context, our approach to policing protest is that we will support and facilitate lawful and peaceful protest. That is, we'll work with protest organisers, we'll negotiate arrangements, and we'll do everything to make sure that the protest can occur peacefully without adversely affecting the rights of others, but also, of course, supporting the right to protest within the context of a liberal democracy. Now, of course, when we're policing in a context where the Chief Health Officer has issued directions preventing people from leaving home to protest because of the public health risks and the right to life held by everyone in the community, and against a backdrop where we were starting to see hundreds of deaths and very significant community transmission, the policing approach had to shift, and that was reflected in how we sought to police protest at the height of the restrictions. And this saw us engaging in a whole range of activities which were remarkable from a policing perspective. Our key thing was to prevent significant public gatherings. So instead of just waiting for people to turn up and regulate what happened there, we deployed very significant resources to go forward and engage with people who were encouraging or contemplating leaving home to protest, to persuade them not to do so. Our public messaging reflected the imperative around preventing large gatherings. And some of you will know, of course, that I had a few things to say about that. The key piece for us was to prevent thousands of people turning up to a protest, and instead, through early engagement and what we call depth in defence, prevent and minimise the harm that would flow from a mass spreading event. So the key point that I would make about our approach to policing and human rights is we have remained committed throughout our approach to policing protests to having regard to policing protests within the context of the provisions of the Charter. And so there's one final piece that I will share with you before I conclude. This is a slide which, I've been told I can't share a slide. So we apply in every policing operation what we call a plan approach. That is, we focus and assess whether or not the impact of our policing approach is proportionate, whether it's lawful, whether it's accountable, and whether what we're doing is necessary. And I can certainly say to you, as the police commander who was responsible for policing protest in our city, that has absolutely been a key part of our focus in terms of ops planning, and also in terms of our ongoing engagement with Verioc over the course of this emergency. Because we've also sought to work with Verioc in relation to how do we get that mix right. And we've paid close attention to the protest explainer that Verioc has published and updated over the course of these very trying times. So in the interest of time, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion, presentation of other presenters and your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luke. You certainly were at the pointy end of some of the COVID-19 human rights issues in the last 9 months. I was particularly pleased to see your public comments stating that protest is a human right during that time, and really imbuing some of the human rights framework into the way that you manage the protest issue. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is Nerita Waight, a Yorta Yorta woman and the Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. Nerita began her career in the public service before commencing work at VALS in 2014, undertaking both legal and policy work. As CEO, Nerita focuses on developing innovative solutions to ensure that the service provides legal and community justice supports at the earliest point and in a culturally safe and caring way. Alongside her role at VALS, Nerita is also co-chair of the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Services. I'm very pleased to welcome Nerita Waight.
Thank you, Emily, for that warm introduction. And I would just like to acknowledge the country that I'm on today, which is my own country, the land of the Yorta Yorta people, and constantly gives us strength and revitalisation when we desperately need it as a result of separation for COVID-19 that many of our communities suffered, but also I think just the ongoing mental drag that I'm sure we're all going through towards the end of the year. It's critical to recognise that the lessons to be learnt from this pandemic are not something to be applied in the distant future. These lessons need to be incorporated immediately as we start down the road of recovery from this pandemic. We should take this opportunity to address the shortcomings and failures of the legal system, which have contributed to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Aboriginal people. Prior to the COVID pandemic, VALS were seeing increases between 18.75% to 20% for our criminal, civil and family law files. In the case of family law and child protection matters, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this increased by 450%. And we now have our criminal lawyers carrying on 150 files or more at any one time, and our civil team being inundated with tenancy matters, employment matters, but also heartbreakingly criminal inquests. In our view, a government that is truly committed to Aboriginal self-determination, to ending the systemic racism that characterises our criminal, civil and family law systems, and to creating a just and equitable society would take Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginal organisations lead in implementing reforms. In a year that has been characterised by COVID, there has also been an incredible show of solidarity across Victoria and Australia, as well as internationally, as the Black Lives Matter movement brought national attention to the long-standing injustices faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Acknowledging how this country's colonial history has created and shaped structures and institutions characterised by racism, which so often fail to deliver true justice for our people, is critical. We can't go back to the status quo to simply rebuild the broken and ineffective systems we had pre-COVID. We need to have more ambitious aspirations to build better, fairer, more culturally appropriate justice systems. If we've learned one thing from COVID, it is that we are all inextricably interconnected. We can't, as a society, as a community, continue to ignore those who are most disadvantaged and marginalised. And there were certainly instances when the government did acknowledge this, such as when people who were homeless were put up in hotels. Unfortunately, there were also examples where government responses failed to acknowledge our interconnectedness and to strike the right balance between restrictions aimed at protecting community health and upholding people's rights. The government and police did not prioritise providing public health messaging and supporting people to comply with the COVID restrictions. Police powers were expanded significantly, and the end result was that Aboriginal people received a disproportionate number of COVID-19 fines. During the pandemic, VOWS has been advocating for the rights of people detained in prisons and youth detention. People in detention are incredibly vulnerable, unable to take protective steps such as physically distancing, which we're also used to now, living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, and are not provided with medical care equivalent to that in the community. Aboriginal people in custody are also particularly vulnerable to becoming seriously ill or dying due to COVID-19, with many people having underlying medical conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, and chronic illnesses such as cancer or the like. In the year, the Sentencing Advisory Council released statistics that show that Victoria's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander imprisonment rate more than doubled between 2009 and 2019. My people continue to be the most incarcerated people in the world. VOW's advocacy highlighted that decarceration must form part of a comprehensive and responsible public health response, with staff and detained people moving in and out of detention on a daily basis. Any outbreak in detention would have an amplifying effect on COVID in the community. Despite international experts urging governments to release people from detention and curb admissions, the Victorian government instead relied on harmful lockdowns and protective and transfer quarantine. There are COVID-specific lessons to be learned here, but these lessons should also inform our approach to justice more broadly. And when you talk about those lockdowns, the protective and transfer quarantine, what we were seeing from the welfare checks that we conducted on our community members in custody were that they were feeling extreme mental stress. And that wasn't just in a couple of days, that wasn't 4, 7, 14 days down the road. Those conditions were worsening day by day, hour by hour, which then places more stress on our community and their family outside as we all try and work desperately to prevent another death in custody, particularly when they've become so frequent here in Victoria. If the government is to achieve the stated objective under the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, which I'm doubtful, and meet its commitments under closing the gap, again, doubtful, it must implement reforms VOWS has been advocating for over many years, such as raising the age of criminal responsibility, reversing the failed bail reforms, and ending police impunity. And it is obviously crucial that our service, which was chronically underfunded before the pandemic, be properly funded as we move forward. This systemic entrenched barrier impedes our ability to properly assist some of the most vulnerable Victorians and effectively silences their voices. Just a few months ago, the Victorian government made a commitment under the Closing Gap Agreement that Aboriginal people will be supported to recover as quickly as the rest of the community from the pandemic's social and economic impacts. The legal sector anticipates increased legal need during the recovery phase, and earlier I talked about what we faced in terms of service demand, which, given we're just at the first step of recovery, if we look at the overall plan, we expect that to grow exponentially day by day, week by week, month by month. Yet it is clear from the recently released budget that the government continues to rely on a law and order approach that has been proven not only to fail to deliver on community safety, but further entrenches existing disadvantages and perpetuates Aboriginal people's gross overrepresentation in the justice system. We are more comfortable with imprisoning my people than supporting them. The budget delivered $103.6 million for the Corrections and Youth Justice COVID-19 response, $38.9 million for Victoria Police's, sorry, somebody's already trying to chase me. Victoria Police's COVID-19 response, but only $2 million for VOWS, and that was after begging. The government's decision ignores the evidence that has time and time again demonstrated, particularly during the pandemic, that an Aboriginal self-determined approach is the most effective one. It ignores the evidence that failing to address legal needs as early as possible is economically unsound and will lead to greater social and economic costs in the short, medium, and long term. Not addressing those legal needs in reality would mean that, as we've seen over generations, my people would continue to be the most incarcerated in Earth. They'll continue to lose their children. Those children will continue to lose their connection to culture, kinship, and country. These decisions also ignore the recent findings and recommendations of the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements that once an immediate crisis passes, recovery support must include legal assistance, and that non-government sectors involved in response and recovery should establish their own strategies and plans to address the recovery needs that follow natural disasters, which of course requires adequate funding. Not properly funding Aboriginal organisations is a denial of Aboriginal people's self-determination and very clearly signals that to the government, a future of perpetual disadvantage and marginalisation is acceptable, that the current rate of Aboriginal incarceration is palpable. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People has highlighted, government should provide sufficient funding to Indigenous peoples to enable them to design and implement COVID economic and social recovery plans, and states must respect, protect and promote Indigenous people's right to self-determination, including autonomy and self-governance. A genuine commitment to Aboriginal self-determination and achieving the objectives under the AJA and the justice targets of the Closing the Gap Agreement must be demonstrated by properly funding not only just Aboriginal legal services like mine, like JIRA's, but investing in self-determined programs that our communities run and not continually going down the path of investing in pilots, evaluating and then not committing to a long-term approach. This means there is no consistent service response. This means that there is a focus on mitigation rather than prevention. And also, I just want to raise that once again, we need to ensure that our government is committing to ensuring that those services for Aboriginal Victorians aren't just for those living in metropolitan regions or living in high dense areas like Shepparton, where I currently am, or Bendigo, but in other smaller regional centres such as Swan Hill, such as Kyabram, and such as other little places, because every Aboriginal Victorian deserves to have equitable access to culturally safe legal advice and representation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nerita. I think you made such a strong case there, not only for Aboriginal self-determination and community-led responses, but how futile they are without the appropriate resources for those communities to lead those responses. Again, I'm sure we'll have more questions about that when we come to Q&A. We're now up to our final speaker today, who is Stan Winford. Stan is the Associate Director of Research, Innovation and Reform at RMIT's Centre for Innovative Justice. Stan is an expert in innovation and reform in legal and justice systems using user-centred design and use of restorative and therapeutic justice in both criminal and civil law. Stan's work has examined the needs of victims of crime, justice responses to mental health and disability, and more effective approaches to reduce future offending. Stan is a practicing lawyer who's held a number of senior roles in government and community legal services in both legal practice and policy. Between 2007 and 2010, Stan was a senior legal advisor to the Honourable Rob Hulls MP, the Attorney General and Deputy Premier of Victoria, and he has also worked previously as Principal Lawyer and Legal Projects Officer at Fitzroy Legal Service. Stan has published on justice issues and appeared in national and international media as a legal commentator. Over to you, Stan.
Thanks very much, Emily. And it's been really interesting to listen to everyone's comments, and some of what I'm saying has perhaps already been mentioned, so I hope to build on that. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I'm speaking from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to talk about what COVID's meant for people's understanding of rights and what it means for the future of our justice system. The language of human rights can feel disconnected from the realities of everyday life, more suited to conversations between nations at the UN and The Hague than the local hardware store. And yet, since the advent of COVID, it has never been more obvious to ordinary people that when we're talking about human rights, to paraphrase Eleanor Roosevelt, we're talking about their rights in small places close to home. When you're compelled to stay close to home, perhaps a lot closer than you'd prefer to be, the idea of human rights takes on a new urgency. For some, rights have become a catch cry for asserting absolute freedom to continue to live life uninterrupted in an individualistic COVID bubble. For this group, though, it's been harder to grasp the notion that rights are not absolute, that there's a balance to be struck. Yet without a cent being paid to an expensive advertising agency, COVID has created conditions for a substantial community awareness campaign carrying this message. When we're told we're all in this together and that there are sacrifices we must make, we're being told about the continual balancing act that's a central feature of our system of rights protection. The point of our rights discourse and the function of our charter in Victoria is not to prevent governments from doing what's necessary for public health and safety, but to make it clear which rights are being limited and why, enabling the community to see precisely where the balance has been struck. Importantly, this framework also enables us to see how the exercise of power is affecting certain vulnerable individuals and communities more than others. During the lockdown, for example, Victoria Police issued a high number of fines in disadvantaged local government areas. Local government areas with the highest levels of advantage received less than 10% of fines. Aboriginal people and people born in the Horn of Africa were fined disproportionately to their population levels. So COVID has exposed inequality, but it's also taught us a few lessons about how to avoid entrenching it in the future. The hard lockdown of several public housing towers on the 4th of July 2020, almost without warning, seemed to fracture the egalitarian nature of the COVID response to that time. It certainly felt a lot like discrimination to the tower residents. The sudden, overwhelming police presence seemed to imply an imminent threat to security rather than reflect a response to a public health challenge. Complaints to the Ombudsman suggest that many of the residents felt as though they were being singled out, and many of them are still contending with feelings of trauma, anger and confusion. This episode reminded us that legitimacy comes from perceptions of fairness and equal treatment, that communicating the reasons for decisions and actions requires treating people with dignity and respect and meaningfully involving them in the decisions that affect them, and that when people closest to the problem are involved in decisions that affect them, they're often able to come up with the right solutions. COVID's also shown us that even within the slow-moving and hidebound justice system, change is possible. While many other countries moved quickly to address the heightened risk of COVID in prisons by decarcerating vulnerable low-risk prisoners, the Victorian government policy, summarised by the Attorney General in a parliamentary inquiry into government responses to COVID, was, to quote, "keep prisoners in prison and keep COVID out of prison." Despite this, courts have played a role recognising the impact of COVID, and we've seen a levelling off of remand numbers, which had been growing at alarming rates. In a few months during COVID, the prison population fell by about 13%. We now know that it's possible to arrest what had seemed to be an inexorable growth in our prison population. And it's also prompted us to ask several important questions. Should we be locking up so many unsentenced people in prison while they wait for courts to deal with backlogs? Should we hold vulnerable prisoners in extended periods of isolation to manage the risk of infection without access to human contact or educational rehabilitation programs? Are prisons really the only places to house people experiencing homelessness? Are they the right places to treat mental health issues? Are they the right place for women who've been traumatised by family violence and sexual assault? Why are Aboriginal people so massively overrepresented in the criminal justice system, despite deaths in custody? And why are so few community-controlled non-custodial alternatives available? should we be locking school-aged children up at all? Meanwhile, courts have been forced to adapt by using technology to hold remote hearings, a change that might not have occurred for another 60 years, if at all, took place in less than 6 months. As well as showing us that there is great capacity for innovation, this experience has reminded us that courts are actually a service system, not necessarily a physical place, and that they should be accessible and user-centred. As well as the challenges for courts, there have been unexpected benefits. Vulnerable clients have told their lawyers that the fear associated with physically attending courts, queuing exposed on the street, going through heavy-duty security, being unable to find the right courtroom or to understand hidden protocols has diminished. Remote hearings have also been a great leveller, enabling intimate and often motivational conversations with magistrates, no longer behind an elevated, distant bench. In many ways, this has reinforced the value of the therapeutic approaches that are already taken in specialist courts like the Koori Court or the Assessment and Referral Court list, where conversation happens around a table. While the backlogs facing our courts will be substantial, since before COVID around 5,000 cases were dealt with in our magistrates court and now about 200 a day, the backlog will be challenging to overcome, but it also offers further opportunities for innovation. How can the courts effectively address the underlying issues that have brought people into the justice system while ensuring that the administration of justice is not subordinated to administrative efficiency? Identifying what to keep from this period of great change and what to let go will be a very important piece of work over the coming months. Focusing on the people at the centre of our justice system will be a critical guiding principle if we are to ensure that our justice system after COVID can function to protect and promote human rights and to work as a positive intervention in people's lives. Thanks.
Thanks, Stan. It's so interesting to think about the changes to the court system that have happened in the last 9 months, including, you know, the opportunities that it provides for innovation there. So we've now come to the end of our TED Talks, and we're going to be moving into the Q&A portion of today's events. So we'll be welcoming back our speakers, who should all hopefully appear on the screen shortly. Thank you in advance to those of you who have submitted questions for the panel. If you have a question you'd like to ask them, please submit it via the Q&A function that's on your screen, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Great, now I've got a speaker view so I can see all your faces. We have a question around human rights and that framework, and this is something that I can ask of all of you. I think I'm interested to know the extent to which you use a human rights framework and see that as useful in the work you do, whether it's in academia or in the police. And we've also got another question that's really asking about if you have perspectives on human rights as an imported white framework. So would anybody like to go first? We can just do a hands up. Roj?
On the matter of rights, I think that as a former refugee, potentially the kind of concepts of like human rights seemed quite central to the sense of hope that we had when we were running from displacement and persecution. And so there was this kind of like broader, you know, there's a historical reference for human rights, and the international perception and understanding of human rights was developed by the Global South. So there is an investment in that, and that kind of sort of answers the second question. But my problem is that rights are often given within the kind of socio-political and nation state structure that if it is formed from colonial dispossession and colonization will always arbitrarily create inequities based on like racial, economic hierarchies. So even though we say there is human rights, there are kind of unjust frameworks and deeply embedded systemic ways that people are denied those rights, and that essentially when we do think about them, or when they're practically applied, they're usually applied for a very specific empowered elite group of people that have dominance, whether they're white, able-bodied, cis, straight, you know, those kinds of different demographics. So I sort of try and translate human rights to a kind of material existence and kind of translate them back into a justice framework. Because if you're just talking about rights, that kind of assumes that the state is already formed for you. But if you're from a marginalized community, the state is not formed for you. So accessing those rights from a state that completely denies you, silences you, or oppresses you is not really possible. So we want to step that back and kind of look into our rights through a justice framework about what are those kind of barriers, what are those institutional things that are denying you your kind of material equality and equity.
Thanks, Roj. I think that's a great comment about how you make the experience of human rights real in the world as well. And I think, Tom, you've been nodding and you put your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I completely agree with Roj on this. And I would just add to that by saying, you know, rights framework is extremely useful to sort of pinpoint particular issues and the kinds of goods that we want from governance. But also I think we need to think about structures and what are the kinds of structures we need. Do the existing structures, political institutions and so on need to change? And do we need to add new structures? And I think that's one of the biggest issues we need to, you know, really think long and hard about in the hopefully more post-COVID era. Just as I finish, I just want to say I'm very mindful of the fact that I'm the only speaker who didn't acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm specifically located. And for me, that's the Bunurong, Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. So I just want to pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging.
Thanks, Tom. Nerita, did you have anything you wanted to say on the use of a human rights framework, or the framework as a sort of a white one that's been imported?
No, I think the comments that have been made have covered and have just been nearly repetitive.
Okay, thanks, Nerita. I think just going to some of the ideas that Tom raised in his short speech, I wonder if you could talk, and this is something I think you can all talk to, democracy is about more than formal institutions. It's about the way really that we all participate. And what do you think that everyday Australians can do to strengthen and promote our democracy, given what we've learned over the last 9 months?
So do you want me to take that first, Emily, or yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I suppose when I saw that question, it's actually a question I get asked a lot. And the positive sort of response is there are so many different ways you can sort of, as an individual, connect with, sort of help to enhance, renew our democracy. And that includes everything from, you know, joining an association that covers an issue that you care about, getting more involved with your community. The more we give to our communities, the more we thicken the public space. And we're not sort of, I think one of the biggest questions about COVID is not only what we want from our governments, but how do we see ourselves both as rights holders, but also as active citizens, and what does that look like? So there are so many different ways to do that, but I think this tracks back again to what Roj was saying, was you need the material resources to be able to be a full citizen, to be a full participant in this sort of democratic community. And that includes things like education, that includes things like internet access. So, so those are really important questions.
Thanks, Tom. Did anyone else want to comment on the role outside of institutions? If not, we'll move on. We've got questions coming in, and one for the Assistant Commissioner, Luke Cornelius. People are really interested, I think, to understand more about the considerations of human rights within Victoria Police. Luke, you talked about balancing your role in policing against the human rights of Victorians, particularly around protest. And somebody has commented that they're not sure it tracks well with the Good Friday car convoy protest or the more recent Melbourne Cup Day protest. Do you have a response to that comment?
I guess the observation I'd make is that the rules framework that applied in Good Friday back in April was very different to the recent Melbourne Cup Day protest. And now there were several Melbourne Cup Day protests, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to. The one back in April, certainly there was a focus on preventing protests that would breach the Cho directions. And so the discretion that we exercised in relation to each of those protests certainly took account of that rules-based framework. But look, perhaps what might assist you in understanding what it looks like. I mean, I came in this morning to have a look at my summary of protest activity that is to occur over this weekend. There are 6 different protests occurring across the city in relation to a very diverse range of interests. So there's a climate change one, there's a refugee action one, and then there are some multiple activations planned in relation to what's variously described as the freedom protests. Now, we will be policing those protest events a very different set of rules than what applied Melbourne Cup Day, let alone back in Good Friday. So at the moment, gatherings up to 50 people with no restrictions on the number of households are authorised. And in fact, so long as gatherings of multiple groups which are socially distanced and otherwise compliant with the Cho directions, we're very happy to work with organisers of those protests and facilitate the lawful and peaceful conduct of those protests. And that's what we'll be doing this weekend. As we did last weekend, again with multiple protests. You know, I might say, for example, the refugee protests that have occurred outside the Mantra Hotel down in Preston throughout the entire course of the Cho restrictions. They were suspended only during the highest level of lockdown, but those protests have continued, and we've worked with those protest organisers throughout the last 6 months. I might also make that observation about discretion. Yes, our Chief Commissioner did say that the window for discretion was closing. The window for discretion never closed, and in actual fact, I can say to you, when I looked at the data yesterday, when I look at the total number of Cho-related enforcement activity, 23% of identified breaches resulted in a warning as opposed to a fine being issued. So discretion has been exercised by our members right throughout the course of the Cho lockdowns. Certainly we've been issuing fines, and certainly we've been issuing fines in relation to flagrant breaches, which is another term that our Chief Commissioner has used. And the flagrant breaches are those ones really where there's absolutely clear evidence of willful non-compliance. And so the principles around exercise of discretion in that context have continued to apply.
Thanks, Luke. I think it's really useful to hear from you just how those considerations are dealt with inside Victoria Police. We've talked a lot today about the limitations and difficulties we've experienced through COVID. And I wondered if our panelist had some thoughts about some of the good that's come out of it. What have we seen that we want to emerge, that we want to take into the recovery, the post-COVID era? I think some of you touched on those things. I'd love to hear a bit more. Roj?
One of the most amazing things is that over the last 10 or so years of my work doing community organising and campaigning is that we've been slowly building in-depth relationships between, a broad range of communities, refugee communities, undocumented migrants, international students, communities of colour, First Nations communities, and slowly building those relationships of integrity and really supporting one another to build our political literacy and understand the kind of ways that our, existence is very intertwined, our liberations are very intertwined and interconnected. And so I think the most amazing things that I witnessed is these communities really putting all of those relationships and those links together to great effect during COVID-19. And although, like many of these communities, international students, undocumented migrants, temporary migrants, were denied access to support, which was unfair and I still stand against, these communities turned to each other and supported one another. That's not doubting that people were left behind, but I think that that's really integral, that we should always, even though it feels like a momentous task to build those relationships and to build those partnerships, I think it's really integral, especially when people are facing unemployment, homelessness, and disproportionate targeting from police. I think also one of the things that for myself as an able-bodied person is to actually understand how a disability framework can really improve the way that our societies function, and to put disability justice at the center of our recovery, and to understand that we need to make things more accessible to ensure that we actually introduce a proper universal healthcare where anyone in this country can access healthcare and support, mental health care as well, and also have the means to live a full existence and a fully meaningful existence that is interconnected. So I think that's one thing that a lot of us have been deeply moved by, and I think that it's like a great, I feel quite apologetic that it's taken a global pandemic like this to really reckon with that, but I think it's an important lesson.
Yeah, thanks, Roj. Did anyone else want to comment on things that have emerged to preserve, Luke?
Yeah, if I may, I think I would be the first to acknowledge that we were seriously underprepared in relation to the community engagement challenges around this. We've long prided ourselves in terms of having a focus on community engagement, but I have to say all of the pandemic plans that we had pointed to community engagement more as a concept rather than recognising the need that the time to build community engagement, of course, was well ahead of any pandemic. And I think that's certainly been a particular gap on our part, as it has been for all of our partner agencies. But one of the things that certainly underscored for me was the need and value of that local engagement is critical. So, for example, when we were looking to support the family and the community that was so traumatised by the gang-related stabbing of a Pacifica Islander boy a couple of months ago, at the height of the Cho lockdowns, we were able to work with that community and that family to support grieving and recognition of that tragedy in the community in a way that didn't breach the Cho directions. And that's not an end in itself. It was about promoting public safety and preventing a gathering from occurring that would result potentially in transmission of the virus out in a suburb that had been identified as a hotspot suburb. So We're only able to do that because of local connections and being able to be connected with local community capability that prior to the pandemic just simply wasn't on our radar. I mean, our approach had defaulted to dealing with pan-representative organisations and with institutions that sort of, if you like, brought community groups together. But in actual fact, we've found that oftentimes those entities lack community constituency and in fact don't allow us to engage with the people on the ground that we should be. And so if there's one key takeout from me from all of this, it is the need for all of my frontline managers to be a lot more focused on being engaged locally with their communities.
Thanks, Luke. That's really good to hear. Did anyone else want to make a comment on things they want to maintain? Nerita?
Hey, Emily. In terms of what we saw from Aboriginal communities, we saw a lot of services move online and move to telephone and video conferencing. And not only did that mean that some services could continue for essential supports, but also that our youth actually had a new way to engage with services. And considering they seem to live their whole lives on the internet, it meant that we had a very consistent way to engage with them and to ensure that they were aware of the true directions, aware of the restrictions, but also aware of what supports were available to them in terms of doing their schooling at home, not having the ability to do their sports, which is very important in the Aboriginal communities, I'm sure you're aware, but also not having the ability to engage with community, extended family, culture, and making sure that they were still feeling as though they were connected to a community, had that support. So I think those were the things that we really want to take forward. And also that consistent contact that we were able to achieve for prisoners who often wouldn't have contact with family members or children because they can't travel to the prisons, either due to health or legal circumstances. That was also fantastic to see.
And are you talking there about sort of greater ability to speak over the phone or by video from cells?
Yes, but they were also doing it via video conferencing. So some of our Aboriginal inmates were able to access iPads and able to see with their kids their bedrooms and, you know, their new bikes and trampolines. And I know that sounds really small, but in the scheme of things, it's really big for that connectivity and feeling as though you're still part of your kids' lives.
Oh, God, that's great. Oh, that's a good note to end on. I think I'm being told that we're out of time now. So please join me in thanking our speakers today. They were, I'm sure you'll all agree, an almost constant flow of thought-provoking ideas and valuable reflections and unique perspectives that really highlight for us the absolute necessity of keeping human rights front and centre as we go into the COVID-19 recovery. To our panel, I'm sure I speak for all our participants today when I say how much we appreciated your time and your insights. It's comforting to know that there's such generous and experienced individuals working to advance Victoria's response to the pandemic. A reminder too that part 2 of our Equality Talks series is taking place next Tuesday, the 8th of December at 12:30. Whilst this session that we've just done reflected on the year that was, the next one, New Frontiers, is going to look to the future. And the panel will be presenting their visions for how we can build back better after COVID-19. You'll hear from Indy Clark from the Career Youth Council, Sandra De Mayo from Vic Health, Vishal Kishore from RMIT Health Transformation Lab, Lynn Morgaine from Oxfam Australia, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch, and Edie Shepherd from Original Power. It's going to be a really super and engaging session. And to close Human Rights Week, don't forget about our annual Human Rights Oration with Australia's first female Prime Minister, the Honourable Julia Gillard. She'll be speaking with our Commissioner, Kristen Hilton, and RMIT's Vice Chancellor, Martin Bean, about mental health, equality, and how this moment of disruption could act as a catalyst for a fairer, more equitable society. Registrations are still open, so please come along. And on behalf of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission and our partner RMIT's Social Innovation Hub, thank you for joining us for Equality Talks, and happy Human Rights Week to everyone.